My name is Marion Pierce, and I never imagined the moment my own son would look at me as if I were a burden. It happened on Christmas Eve, in the middle of his beautiful 3-story home in Seattle, the one he always bragged about as proof that he had made it. I was standing at the end of the dining table, still holding the platter of roasted turkey I had spent half the day preparing, when Evan suddenly pushed back his chair. The legs scraped hard against the hardwood floor, louder than the holiday music playing behind him. He raised his voice so everyone could hear. "Mom, you need to start paying rent like any other adult, or you need to pack your things and get out of my house." For a second, I thought I had misheard him. The room fell into a silence so sharp I could hear the fireplace crackle. 22 people stared at me. Neighbors, co-workers, extended family, even my daughter-in-law, Chelsea, who sat there swirling her wine as if this was all perfectly reasonable. I felt the heat rising in my face, not from embarrassment, but from something deeper, something like disbelief mixed with a quiet kind of heartbreak. Evan didn't look away. He stood there waiting for my reaction, arms crossed as if he were confronting a tenant who hadn't paid in months. I set the platter down on the edge of the table before my hands could start shaking. I looked at my son, really looked at him, and I realized he had no idea who he was talking to. He didn't know the truth about the house he claimed as his, or the car parked in his driveway, or the credit card Chelsea used like it was her birthright. All he saw was a mother overstaying her welcome. And in that moment, I knew something inside our family had already broken, long before he said those words. The moment Evan's words settled into the room, something inside me went still. Not shattered, just still. The way a lake freezes overnight without warning. I didn't say anything at first. I simply set the turkey down on the far end of the table and wiped my hands on the apron I had worn for the past 6 hours. The chatter that had filled the house only minutes before faded into an uncomfortable quiet, the kind where everyone pretends to look elsewhere so they don't have to acknowledge what they just witnessed. I remember watching Evan's jaw tighten, as if he expected me to protest or fight back, but I couldn't. There was no part of me left that wanted to argue with my own son in front of strangers. Instead, I reached up and smoothed a loose strand of hair behind my ear. It was the kind of small gesture a woman makes when she's trying to keep her dignity from slipping through her fingers. Aunt Linda, who had flown in from Sacramento, shifted in her chair and looked away. She had never been brave enough to stand up to anyone in her life, and she certainly wasn't going to start with my son. Evan's co-worker, a young man who had introduced himself earlier as Trevor, cleared his throat and took a sip of wine, pretending to be fascinated by the wreath hanging above the fireplace. Even the kids stopped giggling in the living room. Chelsea glanced at her phone like she had something more important to deal with, though the only notification lighting up her screen was a promotional email from a skincare brand she endorsed. She didn't look worried or surprised. She looked prepared. That was what struck me the hardest. She had seen this moment coming. Maybe she had even encouraged it. My chest tightened, not from humiliation, but from a cold understanding that I had been the only one unaware of how little space I truly took up in that house. I took a breath, slow and steady, before I finally spoke. "Evan," I said quietly, "is this really the time for this conversation?" He shrugged, as if the timing didn't matter because the conclusion had already been drawn. "It's overdue. Mom, you've been staying here for months without helping. It's not sustainable. Chelsea and I talked about it, and it's only fair." Fair. The word sliced through me sharper than anything else he had said. I saw Chelsea straighten her posture, as though the mere mention of her confirmed that this was a united front, her and Evan on one side of the table, and me on the other. The line had been drawn so invisibly but so deliberately that I almost admired the precision of it. I stepped back from the table and untied my apron. The cotton strings slipped easily from my fingers. "You're right," I said, and my own calmness startled me. I shouldn't impose on anyone's home, especially during the holidays. Evan blinked, confused by how quickly I seemed to accept his terms. He had expected resistance. He had expected a scene. Instead, I simply folded the apron and placed it beside the stack of plates. "I'll gather my things tonight," someone gasped. Maybe Linda, maybe one of Chelsea's friends, but I wasn't paying attention. My eyes were on Evan, and for the first time in years, I saw a flicker of doubt cross his face. Just a flicker. Not enough to undo what he had said, but enough to show that he hadn't expected me to walk away so easily. Chelsea let out a soft sigh of relief, almost too quiet for others to hear. But I heard it. It was the sound of victory, the kind that comes when you push someone out of a life you think you can maintain without them. I walked toward the hallway, feeling more like a guest than a mother. Along the way, I passed the family photos lining the wall, pictures Evan insisted on displaying even though most of them were taken during phases of his life he barely remembered. In every single one, I was there beside him, holding him up on his first day of preschool, smiling at his high school graduation, crying quietly at his wedding when his father couldn't be there to see it. And yet, somewhere along this timeline of shared history, I had become someone he could dismiss with a single sentence. Inside the guest room, the world felt different, quieter, colder, almost foreign. The bed sheets I had washed 2 days earlier still smelled faintly of lavender detergent. My small suitcase sat in the corner where I had left it, half opened with clothes neatly folded inside. I hadn't planned on going anywhere. I hadn't planned on being thrown out of the life I had helped build. When the door closed behind me, I finally let my shoulders drop. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of years pressing down at once. There was a moment, a single second, when I wanted to cry, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to release the grief sitting heavy in my chest. But I didn't. Instead, I walked to the window and looked out at the neighborhood. Snow had begun to fall in slow, soft flakes, settling quietly on cars and rooftops. The street looked peaceful, lit by warm porch lights and decorated pine trees. Everything outside looked like the Christmas scenes people put on postcards. Inside, my world was unraveling. I sat on the edge of the bed and clasped my hands together. The truth Evan didn't know. The truth he had never bothered to ask about, pressed at the back of my throat, that house he claimed as his sanctuary, the car he drove with such pride, the credit card his wife used without hesitation. They didn't belong to him. None of it did. But I realized then, as I stared at my packed suitcase, that the real issue wasn't the house or the money or the possessions. It was the fact that somewhere between the boy I raised and the man standing in that dining room, my son had forgotten who I was. And maybe, just maybe, it was time for him to remember. When I finally stepped out of that guest room with my suitcase trailing behind me, the house felt different. It wasn't the home I used to know, where Evan would come running down the stairs in mismatched pajamas on Christmas morning, or where he used to beg me to hang his school drawings on the fridge. This place felt curated, like something out of a magazine, perfect on the outside, hollow underneath. I realized then that I had been living as a shadow in my own son's world, tolerated but never truly welcomed. As I moved down the hallway, voices drifted from the dining room. They weren't whispering anymore. Whatever discomfort they felt moments earlier had softened into a dull murmur, as if my leaving had smoothed over the awkwardness and allowed them to return to their holiday celebration. I paused halfway, listening. I could hear someone laugh. It wasn't cruel, but it wasn't kind either. It was simply the sound of people choosing to ignore what didn't concern them. I reached the front door and slipped on my coat. Evan appeared behind me just as I wrapped my scarf around my neck. He didn't look angry, just impatient, the way someone behaves when dealing with a minor inconvenience. "Mom," he said, rubbing his temples, "you don't have to leave right this second. I just needed to set some boundaries. We can talk tomorrow when things calm down." "Tomorrow," I repeated softly. "Of course." He didn't hear the tone behind my words. He didn't see the exhaustion in my eyes or the quiet resignation settling into my bones. He simply nodded, as if he had solved a small household problem, and went back toward the dining room. I stepped outside into the cold. The air bit at my cheeks, but I welcomed it. It felt honest, sharper and truer than the warmth inside that house. My car wasn't parked far. Evan had insisted I use one of the company vehicles months earlier, saying it would make errands easier. Back then, I thought he was being considerate. Now, I understood it differently. He wanted to feel like the provider, even though the car technically belonged to a company he had never contributed to. I brushed the snow off the windshield and sat silently behind the wheel for a long moment, hands resting on the steering wheel. The street was quiet except for a family across the road taking a photo under their porch light. The father lifted his son to place the star on the small pine tree beside their front steps, their voices filled with laughter. I watched them longer than I meant to. It reminded me of a time when Evan and I had shared moments just like that. What had happened to us? When had the closeness between mother and child stretched into this unrecognizable distance? As I drove away from the neighborhood, the image of Evan, arms crossed, eyes cold, kept returning to me. I couldn't erase it. But beneath that painful picture, something else stirred. It wasn't anger. It wasn't revenge. It was clarity. The kind that arrives only after a wound has already been opened wide. By the time I reached my apartment in Tacoma, the snow had thickened. The parking lot was almost empty, with only a few dim porch lights flickering in the cold. I carried my suitcase up the stairs, the wheels bumping softly on each step. The familiar smell of my hallway greeted me: laundry detergent, old carpet, someone's leftover soup drifting from a neighbor's door. Inside my apartment, everything was exactly as I had left it: quiet, plain, mine. I locked the door behind me and set the suitcase near the couch. My legs felt weak, but I didn't sit down. Instead, I walked straight to the small desk in the corner, turned on the lamp, and opened my laptop. I didn't hesitate, didn't second guess. My fingers moved with the certainty of someone who has carried the weight of responsibility all her life. I logged into the Harbor Point system, a system Evan didn't know existed beyond the vague idea of Mom's old job. The dashboard opened to a list of properties, each one familiar, each one a piece of the legacy my late husband and I had built from nothing. I clicked on the address Evan called his house, lease agreement, landlord signature, renewal date, January 31st. I stared at the screen for a long moment, letting the truth sink in. Evan had spoken to me as if I were living off his generosity, when in reality he and Chelsea had been living inside a life built entirely by my sacrifices, and somehow he still believed he was the one supporting me. The hurt from earlier shifted into something steadier, something that felt like resolve. I clicked the button to generate the non-renewal notice. The form populated automatically, formal, cold, precise. My name appeared only in the legal section of the trust. Evan would see the message, but he wouldn't see me behind it. Maybe that was better. Maybe anonymity was the only way he would listen. I pressed send. The notification disappeared with a soft chime, and in that moment, the weight inside my chest eased just a little. Not enough to erase the pain of what had happened that night, but enough to remind me that I still had control over my life, even if my son had forgotten who I was. I closed the laptop gently and stood there in the silence of my apartment. The snow outside continued to fall, covering everything in a soft white blanket. It felt like the world was trying to start over. Maybe I needed to do the same. The next morning arrived heavier than the one before. I woke before sunrise, not because I had slept well, but because my mind refused to let me rest. The apartment was still cold. The heater needed a few minutes to warm up the air, so I wrapped an old knitted shawl around my shoulders and stood beside the window. Tacoma was quiet at that hour. The sky was a shade of deep blue, almost black, with a thin silver glow beginning to spread along the horizon. It should have been peaceful, but my thoughts churned beneath the calm surface. I replayed Evan's expression from the night before, the way his voice carried authority he hadn't earned. Not yet. Not the way his father had earned every inch of respect he ever received. I wondered what my husband would have said if he had witnessed all of this. He had been gone for 7 years, and yet his presence lingered in moments like this, moments where my heart felt divided between love and disappointment. By mid-morning, I forced myself out of the house. Staying inside felt too much like drowning. I needed air. I drove toward the Harbor Point Administrative Building in downtown Seattle, a place I rarely visited these days. The company ran smoothly without my constant involvement, but today felt different. Today I needed to face the life I had kept hidden from my son. Daniel, our CEO, was already in his office when I arrived. He looked up, surprised, and stood immediately. "Marion, I didn't expect to see you today," he said, his tone gentle in a way that told me he already sensed something was wrong. I removed my gloves slowly, buying myself a moment before speaking. "I sent the notice last night," I said. He nodded, understanding instantly. "For Evan's property?" "Yes." My voice held steady, but my hands tightened around the gloves until the soft leather creased beneath my fingers. It needed to be done. Daniel studied my face the way someone studies a map, trying to understand the roads before asking which one led to the wound. "How did he take it?" "He doesn't know yet," I said, "but he will soon." He motioned for me to sit, and I did, sinking into the familiar chair across from his desk. I remembered sitting there with my husband years ago, the two of us discussing plans to buy our first renovation project. Back then, the room felt too big for us. Now it felt small, but only because I carried so much history inside my chest. "You're doing the right thing," Daniel said. "Sometimes the only way people learn is when the ground shifts underneath them." I stared at the window behind him. Seattle's skyline shimmered under the winter light. Tall buildings layered like steps toward the sky. It struck me then how long I had lived in the shadows of those buildings. My husband had built them with his hands, and I had kept them standing with my mind, yet my son knew none of it. "It shouldn't have come to this," I whispered. "No." Daniel agreed softly. "But it has. And now he has to face what he's become." His words settled into the room like a quiet truth neither of us could avoid. After a moment, he reached for a folder and placed it gently in front of me. "These are the updated financial statements you requested last month. I thought you might want to review them." I opened the folder slowly, scanning the pages filled with numbers, balances, projections. It was a world Evan had never asked about, a world he never bothered to understand. My thumb brushed across one of the documents, a quarterly report listing the rental income from his house. Seeing it in black and white made something inside me ache. He had spoken to me last night as if he carried the weight of me on his back, when in reality, his entire life had been cushioned by the things I had built. I closed the folder gently. "Thank you, Daniel." I stood to leave, but he stopped me with one more question, a simple one, but it pierced deeper than I expected. "Marion, what do you hope happens next?" I looked at him for a long moment. The truth came slowly, crawling out of a place too tender to touch. "I don't want him to suffer," I said. "I just want him to grow." Daniel nodded with the understanding of someone who had raised children of his own. Growth rarely comes easy. "I know," I replied, "but he's my son, and I can't carry him anymore." As I walked out of the office, the cold wind greeted me again, sharper this time, as if the world itself was urging me forward. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and when I glanced at the screen, my heart instinctively tightened. It was from Evan, a single message. "Mom, the lease notice. What's going on? Please call me." I didn't answer. Not yet. Not until he was ready to hear the truth without twisting it into a weapon. I slipped the phone back into my coat and stepped into the street, the winter sunlight catching on the snow that still clung to the edges of the sidewalk. For the first time in years, I felt the faintest spark of something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not anger, not fear, but resolve. And I knew the real reckoning, the one neither of us could avoid, was still ahead. Evan didn't speak at first. He just sat there, trying to understand how the woman he had treated like an inconvenience now sat at the head of a table he didn't even know belonged to her. His fingers tightened around the folder he'd brought, as if holding onto it might steady him. "Mom, what is this?" he finally whispered, his voice small in a room too big for him. I folded my hands on the table, letting the quiet settle before I answered. "This company exists because your father and I built it long before you ever learned to walk. We kept it quiet because we wanted you to grow into your own life, not live under the weight of ours." I looked directly into his eyes. "But when you spoke to me the way you did, you left me no choice except to let you see what you've become." His mouth opened, but no words came out. A flicker of shame crossed his face, real shame, not the irritated guilt he used when he wanted to avoid responsibility. This was different. This was the moment the truth finally pierced him. "I thought I was helping you," he murmured, staring down at the polished table, as if afraid to see his reflection. I thought you needed me." "You thought wrong," I said softly. "Not because I didn't want you in my life, but because you never asked. You assumed. You acted out of pride, not love." The words hung between us like fragile glass. He swallowed hard. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Mom." For a moment, neither of us moved. I could see the boy he used to be, the one who held my hand crossing the street, the one who cried when he lost his first tooth, hiding behind the man he had tried too hard to become. I stood and walked around the table, his eyes lifted, uncertain. When I placed my hand on his shoulder, he let out a breath he'd been holding since Christmas Eve. "You will grow from this," I said. "But growth doesn't happen in comfort. It happens when you face the parts of yourself you've avoided." He nodded, tears pooling but not falling. "I want to do better." "I know," I whispered, "and that's why we're here." Outside the boardroom windows, the city shimmered beneath the winter light. Inside, for the first time in a very long time, my son finally saw me, not as someone he could push aside, but as the woman who had carried him farther than he ever realized. And in that quiet, painful, necessary moment, our family finally began again,